I am so excited to announce that iDriveAClassic is now sponsored by Adrian Flux, one of the UK's leading classic car insurers. If you're looking for classic car insurance, I've popped a link to Adrian Flux in the description box below. Hi guys, it's Steph from iDriveAClassic. Happy New Year. We are back for another year of fantastic motoring videos. Now in this episode today, we're looking at the Austin Maxi. Now, many of you have asked for one of these videos purely because many of you have never seen one in the flesh, and I got offered this example by the previous owner, goodness, nearly a year ago to do a film with, and it never happened, and they moved abroad, and the new owner, James, happened to be a good friend, so I said, let's do the video, let's make it happen. So today we're looking at his fantastic Austin Maxi, or as he dubbed it, Britain's fastest bed on four wheels. So we're going to kick off this video by taking a look round the outside. 1969 was the year that man landed on the moon, and the ADO14, or the Austin Maxi as we now know it, became available for purchase as the first car sold by the British Leyland Motor Corporation. The car was sold under the strapline, all the fives. It was meant to be a mid-range, more modern motoring choice for the discerning car buyer. It was a 5-door hatchback with a 5-speed box, and as we discussed in the Austin Allegro video, this fitted perfectly into the Austin stable. So prior to this car, decisions had been made whereby Austin would be the trailblazer. It was meant to be experimental, it was meant to be daring, it was meant to be the brand with the leading technology, whereas Morris, well, that was meant to be the Ford Challenger, so it made perfect sense that the Maxi was sold under the Austin branding. Well, it was for the first 7 years anyway. The Maxi came into the fold to replace the Farina saloons, which had launched in the late 50s, but by this point were proving to look outdated, because when they were sat alongside more modern offerings like the Cortina, they just kind of looked a million miles ahead of things like the Oxford and the Cambridge. Now, unlike many 70s BL cars which were rushed over the line, the Maxi had a little bit more thought and much more investment put into it. Work began in the mid-60s, and as I mentioned later on, one of the biggest design overhauls was due very early on, and it partially came in because of cost. So the team were told that the car had to use doors from the 1800 cars, which meant that the car was longer than planned, and therefore considerably bigger than the Cortina, which was of course what the designers had in the back of their mind, because the Cortina was not only a big seller, it was also fast taking market share away from BL, which was a massive consideration. Now, although we talked about Morris being a Ford fighter, the Cortina was a big consideration when they were coming up with this, and so the Maxi really took that into its stride when thinking about the capabilities of the car, and even impacted the engine choice, which meant that the tired A series, which had been wheeled out for every occasion, wasn't really cutting it, and to be honest, this would have made it a really stodgy slow car, because by the point that they were looking at the A series with this, I think they'd really only started getting up into that 1300 over the last couple of years. So the A series was really not where it needed to be supporting this car. But so that's kind of came about because of course that and the competition, but competition isn't always a bad thing, because it meant then that it challenged the team to come up with something new, which saw the birth of the E series. And in fact, it's an investment which we shouldn't undersell when we talk about this car, because they spent 16 million on a new factory to make the gearboxes and the engines alone. So realistically, it should have been without fault for that level of investment, right? Now, there were some really high hopes for the E series in the early days, and engineers thought it would fly, and they thought it would have 4 different capabilities. So 1160cc, 1300, 1485, and a 2227cc 6-cylinder variant. However, for a myriad of reasons this didn't happen, but it's a real shame, because personally I think with a bit more investment and driving it forward a bit more, I think that we might have seen a stronger replacement for the A series in later decades, and I think it might have had a real impact on the future of BL. Now, when discussing all the fives, it is of course imperative that we discuss the gearbox too. The idea behind it was to remove all the fuss when cruising, or in real speak, make long distance travel at high speeds far less taxing and less noisy inside the car, so that you're not having to shout at people. It was said that the noise levels came right down, but actually, when we go for a drive, you'll see that this car, or this certain example, is actually quite noisy and it's almost off-putting. And in fact, I didn't really notice much difference between driving this in fifth as I do when driving the Morris Minor in fourth, but maybe it's just this particular car. Now, although we've talked about that 5-gear strapline and being 5 gears, there was also an optional automatic gearbox available from the mid-70s, I think about 1974. Now, although this is a car you look at today and feel like it's a really attractive proposition, press reception at launch wasn't great, but it's something that we'll talk about when we go for a drive. Ultimately, it boils down to this: when you take risks and go out and do something really different, it's either a wild success or people really don't like it and shy away from it. And at this point in time, it might be in the swinging 60s, but Britain was still pretty much conservative with a small c, so I'm not entirely surprised. However, it wasn't all down to that, because journalists went out there and they did give it a right slating. So they felt that the cable change was too fussy, the car was underpowered, and when we take this 1500 out for a drive, you'll see that, yeah, it's not the nippiest car on the road, but it's decent enough for a does-it-all vehicle. And that's before we even get into the chatter around the body and the bemusement at reusing those 1800 doors. But they didn't rest on their laurels, because it was this negative feedback which meant that the car got a shakedown in 1970. So they pulled in management, they pulled in senior engineers from Triumph, and with that the range was doubled. So you could have got the 1500 like we're testing here today, or the more exciting 1750. They then moved over to the rod-operated gear change instead of that hated cable change, but the exterior didn't see much change, so it still had the 1800 doors, but a few interior changes that I'll show you when we get in the car, and a new grille as well. The range was expanded again in 72 with the HL, which had the 1750 engine, but now with twin carb setup and a sportier makeover of the interior. So they changed lots of things like the steering wheel, padded dash, etc. And then in 79 they gave the range a shake up again. The HL became the HLS, allowing them to insert a new HL, which was essentially the same car but with a single carb setup. And as the sales petered away on that 1500, it was quietly dropped. And then in 1980, they brought out the Maxi 2, which was introduced in 1980, before the production wound up, in my opinion, a bit prematurely in 1981. It got replaced with the Maestro, which for me is nowhere as cool as this Maxi, and really does prove that not all progress is actually progress. Overall, I think it's a massive shame that the Maxi isn't given more clout as a game changer. It was the first 5-speed box for many British motorists. It brought the hatchback to many a conservative car buyer, and it helped many a type motorist save a shilling or two with those fold-down beds in the back. It also had some famous triumphs, including being the car that John and Yoko famously crashed and then put on a plinth outside their home, and it was the car that Bron Burrell chose to compete with in the 1970 World Cup Rally with her and her team. They went from London to Mexico, and they did over 16,000 miles, which says a lot about these cars. And it was a car so roomy in the boot that it snuck 2 fully grown adults over the border at Checkpoint Charlie and impressed German guards so much they took it apart on national television and showed it in an advert. All in all, some exciting highlights for a car which, in my opinion, is a quirky and fun bit of British engineering. Now, just under 500,000 Maxis were produced, and it might have only been in production for 12 years, but for me they're one of the coolest BL cars ever produced. So whilst it doesn't get the status and the clout it deserves today, I really think that it deserves it for everything it's done and all the different things that it brought to market. But who would buy a Maxi today, and most importantly, why? Now let me introduce the owner, James, because he's going to tell you exactly why I bought this lovely car, Hayley.
Hello, I'm James McLean and I'm the owner of this brilliant 1973 Maxi. It's quite an emotional reason why I bought this Maxi to start with. Unfortunately, this year my partner Natasha sadly passed away, and within grief I thought I needed to keep myself occupied and busy, so I bought myself a new classic car. There's also so many other reasons, like I own a Morris Traveller, so I know what it's like to own a classic car and I absolutely adore them. It also has family connections and ties. My grandparents had a lovely white cable change Maxi in the 70s and I've got some lovely photos of it. Because I'm a member of a well-known caravan club, I also wanted it for its towing capacity. Even though this is a 1500 version, it does pack the punch when you're towing. Because I go up and down the country with caravans, I think I needed something more practical and more easy to drive than a Morris Traveller. So this was the perfect candidate when I found it to be one of my new home and family member. Hopefully this year will be different in the current climate and we can all go out again. I'm so looking forward to going to car shows and steam fairs and just general going out, which I'm sure you're all missing as well.
Now, I'm sure that when I said that I was going to be inviting some subscribers into bed with me today, that many people had a very different idea. But actually, in fact, it's because the seats in this fold down into a bed, one of those mad 70s gimmicks. Now, I'm only 5'3", and let me tell you now, this bed is so uncomfortable. So if there's anybody out there that thought, I might invest in an Austin Maxi, it might help me get a few relationships over the line, honestly, I would rather sleep on the ground than this. It's really, really uncomfortable. I mean, if you didn't have a choice or you were too tight for a travel lodge, it would be great. But as you can see, I mean, how would anyone over the height of probably, I mean, I'm laid down and this is like 5'3". I don't understand how anybody over this height of about 5.5 foot would cope with one of these. It's absolutely crazy. But if you want to keep chiropractors in work and maybe entertain the opposite sex or the same sex for an afternoon, then the bed in this, I suppose, isn't too bad. I'm really excited to show you this Maxi today. I have never even been a passenger in one, let alone the driver. So to get my hands on the set of keys for this, which for me is probably one of the loveliest Maxis I've ever seen, I feel massively privileged, and so it's really exciting to bring it home to you today. And I wanted to show you what we've got inside here. If you are a bit of a Maxi aficionado, you'll notice there are a few little tweaks and differences from the earlier Maxis. So this is like a Maxi 1 or just a Maxi, not a Maxi 2, but there were some small changes made between the earlier cars and cars at this point in production. Now, some of the things that really jumped out to me as I got in were we went to open the bonnet and the bonnet pole wasn't at the front like where it is on the earlier cars. It's actually inside the cabin. For security reasons, I'm not going to show you where that is. Now, we've also got the choke up here. And I believe on earlier cars it was over here. And I'm not sure about the indicator stalk. I think that on the earlier cars is on this side as well. So just a few key things that they changed. I mean, I never understand why bonnet pulls are on the outside of cars. That is asking for trouble. I know it was different, more simpler times, but people were still stealing cars, so never sure why that was ever a thing. But as you can see, with this being a car that's only done 22,000 documented miles from new, you can see that it's still in really great shape. So over here we've got our glove box, and I think this is some sort of plywood veneer finish, but again it all still looks very tidy. James has got all his bits and pieces in there. And we've got one of those air vents over there, so that is just for our heater. Now coming into the middle, so we've got our cigar lighter up the top there, our heater controls in the middle, our aforementioned choke there. Now this blanking plate is where the stereo would have been. So they didn't pay extra for a stereo, but I tell you what they did pay extra for, an ashtray. Just open the windows. Anyway, you've got the ashtray down here, so that's just there, full of lots of pennies at the moment. And then coming in front of us, this is all the other bits that we've got. So as you've probably already noticed, we have only got one stalk coming off the steering column, and that is for our indicators and for our horn. And then we've got a selection of switches and dials in front of us. So over here, we've got our wipers, 2-speed in case you're wondering, our fan control, again 2-speed. Above that, the electric washers, and then over to my right hand side, and this sounds really tragic, but this little light switch reminds me of the characters of Smash. So again, you've just got side and headlights there, and then looking in front of us we've got our 2 dials. Now I love a bit of simplicity, so to our left we've got our speedo, and to our right the dial is split into 4/4, well, 2 quarters and a half. So the 2 quarters we've got at the top, we've got our fuel gauge and the temperature gauge, and at the bottom we've got 3 warning lights. So we've got oil, the light in the middle is for the indicators, and the right hand side there, that is for the ignition. And one other thing that I wanted to mention, which it was like some sort of deja vu moment, and people always talk about the BL parts bin, but actually really funny, the door handles and the window winders on this are exactly the same as the Marina. And as people always like to say, oh, the door handles are for a Lotus Esprit. Yeah, I know that too. But anyway, just an example of the BL parts bin. Steering wheel looks the same as well. So it kind of feels like I'm not too far away from what I know, and I'm very excited to show you this car today. So to recap, we've got that 1500E series under the bonnet. We of course have got 5 gears, I'll show you that, and let's get her started up and you can hear what she sounds like. Right, let's get her started up and hear what she sounds like. I have been for a little drive already because I was like, please pass me the keys, but I want you to hear what she sounds like too. So and I'm going to shoot from the back as well so you can hear what she sounds like back there too. Now, of course, if you are familiar with the Maxi advertising campaign or the 5s, you'll know one of the 5s was the 5th gear. So we go from first, it feels quite notchy, but it's not on cable change. I'll talk to you about that as we drive actually. Come down into 4th, coming over into 5th. Now getting into reverse, like a lot of BL cars of this era, is simply lift and bring it down, and that brings you into reverse there. Okay, right, we're going to get hopefully up into this 5th gear. Because you really have to be taking the revs quite high into 4th before it'll change really nicely into 5th, which was something that I found out when I took it out driving. And you don't actually seem to stay, unless you're on a motorway or on a long carriageway like this, you don't seem to stay in 5th gear for very long. You're coming straight back down because of course it is a cruising speed. Now the Maxi was born into a really interesting world because 10 years prior, in 1959, we'd had the first motorways open up in Britain. So previously people had used cars and they would have maybe only gone on the A roads or the B roads of Britain or country roads, and so realistically 5th gear wasn't something that people used because the roads were very different. They weren't roads that you would be cruising along at high speeds for a long time. But once the motorways started to spread across Britain, the average driver's world looked very different. In a world where previously it would have been an absolute trek to get, across from, say, Manchester over to Hull or something like that, the route of the M62. Previously that would have taken hours and hours and hours. But with these new motorways, things became easier. But with that, drivers wanted something a little bit more. So that's where the 5th gear came in handy, because it meant that cars like the Morris Minor, for example, that James was talking about earlier, that had previously been revving their absolute heads off as you drove at great speeds, were now far quieter, when you were hitting those motorways and doing the long journeys and the long adventures. But one of the funny things is it wasn't the 5th gear that everyone was talking about when this came out. There were 2 things which people were really uncomplimentary about. Number 1 is the doors. So to basically cut costs, and we were talking about that BL parts bin earlier, they decided to use the doors off the 1800. So it meant that the trunk part of the car looked really exactly the same as the 1800. So for some people, it wasn't the massive revolution that they wanted. They were a bit like, well, it's great, but you know, it has got the doors off that 1800 and it's just not a big enough change for me. And the other thing that people were talking about, and really no reviewer particularly liked, was the cable change on the earlier cars. So this is on rod change, so you can hear the difference. So if you ever listen to a video of the cable changes, they're a lot more noisy, a lot more notchy, apparently a lot harder to drive than this. And they said at the time that one of the things that really didn't sell the Maxi was that gear changes should never be stressful, but the gear change in the early cable changes was just a bit stressy and it wasn't what people were looking for. But by the point they got to this point, things were really looking up for the Maxi, because of course all those earlier problems have been ironed out. And one of the things that I really love about this car is the use of space. So you probably saw on the walk around that we've got so much legroom, front, back, boot. There's nowhere in this car that I feel like it's been compromised on space. And the quality of it as well is really, really nice. And I'm not really surprised that I fell straight in love with it, because of course it was designed by one of my absolute heroes of all time, Alex who, if that name sounds familiar, he of course designed the Mini, the Morris Minor, the 1800. Imagine having a CV like that. It was a man that changed Britain. And the sad thing is that I feel like the Maxi is so underappreciated for what it is, because it's such a nice car to drive, but it's not a car that you see masses of. They've gone up hugely in price the last few years. What was once £1,000 car is now probably more like 3, 4, maybe 5. But I guess the only upside to that is it does protect the last examples. Now, if you remember my Wolseley video we did, the ADO 16, you'll remember me talking about that hydroelastic suspension. It's quite bouncy, it's quite nice, takes bumps really well, and this is what we've got in this as well. So we've got hydroelastic in this, and it's recently been pumped up, so it's doing quite well really. We do think it maybe needs levelling up slightly, but look, it's a very, very small thing, and overall the ride on this is just very comfortable, as are the seats actually, which are nice and wide, they're plush, but I suppose when something has to fold back down into a bed later on, it does need to be quite comfortable. Steering's lovely and precise on this. Honestly, it does feel like, actually it's been a really good choice for James, I think, for long distances, because it does feel like a car that you can take long distances. I'm just surprised by how noisy it is inside. It does feel quite noisy, and especially for a low mileage example. I mean, if you were driving something that really the engine had taken a bit of a battering, I think it'd be far noisier and might be less comfortable on your ears. Whilst everything around you is comfortable, I do think perhaps less comfortable on your ears, because it is quite noisy in here. I'm not complaining, but I am just saying. So overall, what do I think of the Maxi? Well, I really like it. I mean, I'm highly biased. I love most things BL. I like it for what it is. I like it for the fact that it's a car that has been built with a long journey in mind, and it does what it says it's going to deliver. So it's comfortable, it's got so much room inside, it's so spacious. I really can't sell it enough for that reason. It's very comfortable to drive. The seating position is lovely. I've got, of course, plenty of room around me. It's one of the easiest cars I've ever reverse parked, and if it wasn't for how loud it is, which I could fix it with sound insulation, I would, I'd give it 10 out of 10, but really the only thing that lets it down for me is that sound insulation. And it's also worth giving a shout out if you are considering buying a Maxi. The parts are not the easiest thing to get, but there is a chap called, I think he's called Ernie, who does supply pretty much all the bits you need. And there's some really friendly, supportive owners pages and groups on Facebook, and there's different forums. So whilst you may not be able to pop into somewhere like Euro Car Parts or Halfords and find everything, you have got a very supportive community around you that will help you find everything. So that ties us in nicely to the end of the video. It's been such a pleasure to borrow this car off James. I wish him all the best for 2021. It's going to be hopefully a much better year than last one, and I'm wishing a lovely year to all of you at home as well. So hopefully you're still on a bit of a delayed Christmas holiday and you're resting up before we all get back to normal tomorrow or over the next week or so. Until next Sunday, take care and drive safely.